What is a Rebbe? Right, we're talking about Yud Shvat. Yud Shvat is the day on which the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, accepted his position. So what is a Rebbe? What are we talking about? What are we so excited about? As we mentioned before, every single one of us, and a person by definition is a partnership between a body and a soul. That's what a person is. And neither one can be a person without the other. A body without a soul is effectively human state. And a soul without a body would be something like an angel. A body and a soul together in partnership is a person. And the nature of people is that there's a lot within us, a lot within our personality and within our nature that covers over the soul. The soul is divinity. The soul is a little piece of God, a little piece of the Creator. But it has a lot of layers that cover over it. And that's the reason why when we go around about daily life, even though each one of us is divinity inside, we don't necessarily feel that way. And not only don't we necessarily feel that way about ourselves, it's also remotely possible that we may not feel that way about each other and about other people. We may not look at people and just see the divinity, see the God within them. But it's there. You know, and there are a couple of words that could perhaps be sort of general terms to refer to that part of the person. Ego. There's that part of us which is focused on self, self-interested. And the truth is, being self-interested isn't necessarily a bad thing per se. The entirety of the animal kingdom is self-interested. Right? The thing that drives the behavior and every single decision made by every single animal, excepting humans, is self-interest. How can I survive? How can I procreate? How can my genes continue? There's nothing wrong with that. It's the way the world works. It's nature, and it's human nature. How can I survive? How can I continue to live? How can I ensure that my legacy should live on? It's a biological phenomenon. There's nothing wrong with it per se. But at the same time, humans aren't just a part of the animal kingdom. We're different. There are things that make humans stand out from all other animals. For example, we're the only creatures in the world that have articulate speech. We're the only animals alive that can think abstract thoughts. They may very well likely be related. So we're not just the same. We have the ability to rise above that self-interest. Animals don't. No one expects a lion to become vegetarian. It's not its job. Not yet. Correct. Right? It's not immoral or bad for a lion to kill another animal for food. It's its job. It's what it does. Its job is to be self-interested and to look out for its survival. As people, we have two sides of this coin. On one hand, we have the ability to take the self-interest much further than other animals do and to do things that are destructive that we don't need, but they just maybe make us feel good to an extent that other animals don't. The flip side of that is we do have articulate speech and we do have abstract thought. And we can understand, we can learn about ideals, about morals, about purpose. So the self-centeredness in a person has on one hand a tendency to be perhaps bigger and worse than it is in animals. The flip side of that is that we also have the responsibility and the ability to break through that. To break through that self-centeredness and to break through that ego and to try to pursue a life that's purpose-oriented rather than self-oriented. At the same time as we have the ability to do that, every one of us has a soul. Practically speaking, the elements within us, the parts of us that the soul is kind of in tension with and fighting against, are big and strong. It's not like we can just wish upon a star and it goes away, or just snap our fingers or decide to be a good person and all the challenging parts of our personality just disappear. It doesn't work that way. So we are, by definition, we are designed for it to be difficult to live a life that's completely purpose-oriented. It's not supposed to be easy. It may not even be supposed to be practically doable. But it is an ideal that we can aspire to, and we can make progress, and we can move in that direction. But that's something that always limits our ability to live and to practice, to live our lives on a daily basis, in a practical way, in a way that's completely aligned with purpose without interference. We're designed for there to be interference. The interference gives us the opportunity to achieve and to grow. And achievement is perhaps the most valuable thing in the world. At the same time, the fact that we are wired, we're designed for it to be difficult, and we're designed in such a way that those layers that cover up on the soul and get in the way of us living a purpose-oriented life are always there and they're strong, is perhaps, we could say, costly and somewhat dangerous spiritually. So then there are unique individuals who are different. They're different in such that their body and who they are as a human being, as a person, their personal individual character, their personality, is transparent. It doesn't cover over who they are deep down inside. It doesn't cover over the soul and get in its way. It's transparent, and it allows the soul to completely illuminate who they are, to illuminate everything they do, and allows them to have a connection with the Creator, with God, with divinity, with infinity, that's undisturbed, that's completely open and transparent. And it's a very unique thing. The fact that your average person, the fact that I would at least suggest most of us in the room don't have that, is not our fault. It's not because we're not good enough, it's because that's the way it's supposed to be. But at the same time, we are given the gift of some individuals who don't have that issue, some individuals who are transparent, some individuals who are completely and entirely in sync and connected with their soul, with their purpose, and with the Creator that soul comes from. And there's nothing in between, nothing separating. Now, what I've just described is not a Rebbe. What I've just described now is what's called a tzaddik, a holy person, a righteous person. That's half of what a Rebbe is. That's one side of what a Rebbe is. As far as what the other side of what a Rebbe is, I'm going to tell two stories, and the stories will speak for themselves. The stories will make very, very clear what the other half of a Rebbe is. What's the second side of this coin that pairs up with this transparency and this connectedness, and together, these two elements, the two sides of this coin, make up a Rebbe. So the first story is told by someone named Nissim Mengel. He wrote it down, it's in writing, it's been published. It's not just a story that I heard from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone who told them that he said it. It's in writing, it has his name on it. He was a young, probably teenager, a young adult studying in yeshiva, I believe it was in Montreal. And he was boarding there. And in the family that he boarded with, the mother in this family had a history of very difficult pregnancies. And she actually was pregnant while he was there staying in the house. And it was both difficult and it was dangerous for her. And her doctor suggested that she should have an abortion to protect her health. And so her husband asked for a blessing from the Rebbe, asked the Rebbe for a suggestion, and the Rebbe said, and just for the fine print, just to make sure that this is very clear, protecting life is of paramount importance in Judaism. And protecting potential life is a super high priority. Protecting an already existing life comes first. So in the event that an abortion is necessary to protect someone's life, Jewish law halacha says it needs to be done. In this instance, the Rebbe suggested and said that I give you a blessing. The baby is going to come to term healthy. The mother's going to be healthy. The baby's going to be healthy. Tell the doctor to do everything within his ability to bring the baby to term and to deliver it, not to abort the baby. So they come back to the doctor, and the doctor wasn't very pleased that this rabbi's meddling in his business and making things difficult and complicated, but the patients insisted, so that's what the doctor did. And it was long and difficult, the pregnancy, very long and very difficult, something that's that difficult on an hour-to-hour basis, and it's going on for months. It's a very long time. But thank God the baby was born, eventually came to term. The baby was born healthy. They made it through. And so the father of the baby, the husband of this lady, comes to the Rebbe, travels into New York to come to the Rebbe and to thank the Rebbe for the blessing, and to say, thank you, Rebbe, for the blessing. The baby was born healthy on this and this day at this and this time, 2:30 a.m. I don't remember the time, I'm just going to call it 2:30 a.m. for the sake of keeping it simple. And the Rebbe says, the time is wrong. It wasn't 2:30. He says, that's what it says on the birth certificate. And the Rebbe says, I'm telling you the time's wrong. Go back and find out what time the baby was born precisely. It's not 2:30. I can guarantee you it wasn't 2:30. And so his chassid and the Rebbe told him that. So he goes, he comes back, he calls up the doctor, calls the obstetrician and says, what time was my baby born? What do you mean? Look at the birth certificate. He says, I looked at the birth certificate. I have reason to believe that the time on the birth certificate is not accurate. Is it feasible that the time on the birth certificate is not correct, is not precisely accurate? The doctor said it's very feasible. When they filled it out, it's very likely that by the time they filled it out, it was 20 or 30 minutes after the baby was actually delivered, and by the time they finished taking care of everything. And sometimes the person who fills it in estimates back 20, 25, 30 minutes, and sometimes they don't, and they just write the time when they're filling it out. Could be that the baby was born 20, 25, 30 minutes before. It's not unfeasible. Okay, so now it's one step closer, but how's he going to actually find out whether or not that was the case? So the doctor says, look, I don't know, go speak to the nurses, the midwives, find out who signed it, and you can ask them. Chances of them remembering a baby a few weeks ago and they've delivered 3 dozen babies since then, I don't know, good luck, but you could try. And he goes back and finds the person who signed the birth certificate and describes some unique things about the time when the baby was delivered to try to jog their memory. And then she says, you know what, I do remember. I do remember that delivery. And the truth is, actually, you're right. By the time I filled in the birth certificate, it was about 20, 30 minutes after the baby was born. And I wrote the time when I filled it in. So your baby was born a period of time, 20, 30 minutes, whatever it was, earlier than the time on the birth certificate. And now he's starting to freak out. He comes back to the Rebbe and says, the Rebbe was correct. Surprise, surprise. The baby was born 20, 30 minutes earlier. And then he says, how did the Rebbe know? And the Rebbe says, I was awake that night, waiting for your baby to be born healthy. And I know that I was asleep before the time on the birth certificate. This is the second side of a Rebbe. The fact that the Rebbe knew, and the Rebbe was up at night, how did the Rebbe know? It's not the biggest surprise and the biggest miracle. But the fact that despite... You think this was the only person who spoke to the Rebbe in the last 9 months? The Rebbe had tens of thousands of letters from tens of thousands of people in between. The Rebbe spoke to thousands of people on the phone. The Rebbe saw thousands of people in his office. And 3 or 6 or 8 months later, I don't remember exactly what the point was when they came to the Rebbe for the blessing in the first place. All those months and tens of thousands of people and discussions and letters later, the Rebbe was up at night because of that one baby. That's a Rebbe. And the reason that the transparency and the connection that a Rebbe has to the soul, to God, to divinity, to infinity, is relevant to us. It's only relevant if we have a relationship with the Rebbe. The reason it matters is not just because the Rebbe's some guy who has this connection, it's because the Rebbe's also up at night thinking about our problems, unable to sleep. That's what a Rebbe is. And the fact that a Rebbe has that connection matters, because a Rebbe is someone whose life is completely devoted to those around him, completely devoted to every individual, to every single one of us. And a second story, I basically say this story every time I open my mouth, so it's becoming less and less not well known. You'll see why in a minute. Some of you may appreciate the uniqueness of this story more than others. I heard this story directly from the son of the person who it happened to, so this story was not born on WhatsApp. There's a professor in McGill University, I believe it's in Montreal, named Professor Brower, Dr. Brower. He has a son who lives in Crown Heights, who I'm friendly with, and we share some relatives, and I was sitting at a Shabbos table with him once when he told this story. He says his father, who's still a professor, a very senior professor in McGill University, when he was younger and he was looking for a position as a professor, he wrote a letter to the Rebbe and said, I have this offer from this university, this offer from this university, listed all the offers and the different universities and whatever he knew about the conditions. And a period of time later, I don't know, it was days, weeks, whatever it was, he got a letter back from the Rebbe, and the Rebbe underlined McGill and said, you should go to McGill, accept the offer from McGill. So he did, and he's still there now today. It was sometime, if I recall correctly, I believe it was 1992. Professor Brower was in some sort of academic conference in Texas somewhere. And he bumped into a guy who had been on the board of his faculty who was involved in hiring him decades earlier. And the guy, this administrator, says to him, I have a story to tell you. I hope I'm not going to get in trouble. I hope I'm not going to burn for this. I promised I wouldn't tell, but I'm going to tell you anyways. After we made you the offer for a position on the faculty in the university as a professor, and we were waiting to hear back from you, I'm sitting in my office one day and I get this phone call. The phone rings. It's not unusual. I pick it up. And there's this very soft-spoken lady on the other side of the phone, and she asked me, are you so-and-so? And I said, yes. She says, did you make an offer to Professor Brower for a position in the university? Yes. And she says to me, I want to ask you a few questions, but you have to promise me that you won't tell him about this phone call. Okay, sounds kind of weird, but whatever, floats your boat. And he sits on the phone with her, and he says, she asks me about your job description. She asked me about your salary. She asked me about what raises you're going to get. She asked me about your track to tenure. She sounded like she was your mother. Most mothers don't go to this effort for their children's careers. She kept me on the phone for 45 minutes interrogating me about every question I could possibly imagine anyone would ever think of asking about our job offer to you. And she told me her name was Mrs. Schneerson. The Rebbe's wife, was a very, very private person, a very quiet person. She wasn't really a public figure per se, wasn't really involved as a figurehead in an outgoing way at all. And I've never heard a story anything like this. And the reason that I'm so grateful for having heard this story is because it opened up a window into another world. If I hadn't heard this story, I wouldn't have known that this side of the Rebbitzin even existed. Now that we know that this story happened, that we could have happened to have not known about, if that guy had kept his word and not told him, or if he would have happened to just not show up to that academic conference, who knows how many more stories there are like this? Who knows how many hours the Rebbitzin spent on the phone every day, for all we know? You know how many letters the Rebbe got per minute? People from every walk of life, and not only Jews. Thousands and thousands. The Rebbe's flow in of mail was endless. And who knows how many hours the Rebbetzin spent every week, every day, being the Rebbe's partner in all of this work. You know, we kind of think like the Rebbe just reads a letter and then waves a magic wand and gets some inspiration and knows what to tell us. But now we know another part of this picture. The Rebbetzin spent time and effort on the phone, finding out information, doing research. There was no Google. You had to make the phone calls. You had to put in the legwork. And she put in the legwork that people's own mothers didn't put in for them. And the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin are partners. They're a couple, they're one. And these two stories, to me, are perhaps the most important stories in terms of what a Rebbe is. The Rebbe's connection to divinity and transparency and continuity with God is only relevant because a Rebbe is up at night thinking about us and our problems, every one of our individual issues. And the Rebbe cares, and the Rebbitzins on the phone interrogating people in a way that our own mothers aren't doing for us. And we actually saw in the video of the Rebbe was talking about this about his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, to an extent, saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe definitely is still interacting with the world today, even after the previous Rebbe had passed away, after his Yortzeit, his Istalkus. And the Rebbe said that this is clearly evident because this is the way he lived his life. His life was dedicated and committed to us. So now that his soul isn't in his body anymore, what we think his soul just changed interests all of a sudden, his soul was committed every minute of every day of his life to us and to our problems, the Rebbe says, and there's no way that that changed. And I would humbly suggest that the degree to which we see that in the Rebbe, at least in terms of volume and magnitude and the number of people and their problems that the Rebbe carried, individuals, children, parents, teachers, rabbis, ministers of all varieties, politicians, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. I have no idea what the number is of the people who wrote to the Rebbe on an ongoing basis. And the Rebbe read every letter, and the Rebbe cared, and the Rebbe's up at night. This is what a Rebbe is. And this is what we connect to when we study the Rebbe's teachings. And when we learn and become familiar with the Rebbe's perspective and worldview and outlook. Number one is we get a taste of that obsession that the Rebbe has with maximizing our own individual potential and realizing who we're supposed to be and who we're able to be by using our talents, using our gifts, staying healthy. The Rebbe puts a very big emphasis on staying healthy so that we can realize our potential and change the world around us. And the care and concern that the Rebbe has for every single individual, it's something that we connect to. So the Rebbe on one hand has this transparency and continuity with God in a way that is unnatural for a regular human being. And the Rebbe also cares about every single person individually to the degree, not just that he acts like he cares, or not just that he cares, but cares to the degree that he's up at night about someone's baby being born when they wrote to him 50,000 people ago. That's how much a Rebbe cares about every single one of us. And a Rebbe is an opportunity to connect with God, with divinity, with infinity, with the purpose of existence in a way that we can't do on our own. Not just because he has that connection, but because he has that connection with God and divinity, and he also has that connection with us. All we have to do is step up to the plate and say, yes, we want this relationship to be a two-way street. We're going to inform ourselves, empower ourselves with understanding the way that you see Torah, the way you see Judaism, the way you see the world. We're going to understand your interests. We're going to learn to understand what drives you. We're going to learn about your suggestions, your advice, your directives. All we have to do is step up to the plate, because a Rebbe by definition is always waiting to give. And not always waiting to give, is giving without waiting sometimes. But there's no question that when someone steps up to the plate to try and open up a relationship with the Rebbe, that the Rebbe's more than ready to go. That's a Rebbe.